Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Booksmart, our 6-week journey coursing through Judaism's most important titles and the authors who inscribed them, Lesson 4. And today, in Lesson 4, we will be tackling the genre of Jewish literature known as Halachah. Our goals will be to try and understand how Halachah works. How does a posek, firstly we'll introduce what a posek is, but we'll try to figure out how a posek, which is someone who rules halachic laws, rabbinic halachic authority, goes about resolving halachic issues that are presented to them that are obviously not clearly stated in the Torah, or even possibly in any prior work before them. Of course, we're going to do a little tour of the primary halachic works, and when and by whom they were written. And finally, we will try to understand what the Shulchan Aruch, the Jewish code of law, is and how it became the most primary source of halacha. Those are the goals for today. And we'll introduce the topic for today's class by reading 2 texts. So Phil, why don't you get us started? We're on page 148. Let's start with text 1. There you go.
Okay. Text 1.
Mm-hmm.
Instruct them on the statutes and the teachings, make known to them the way on which they should go and the actions that they should do.
Okay. And text 2, Marilyn, if you can read that for us, please.
The word Torah means instruction, as in the word Torah. For the function of Torah is to instruct us in the actions we should do. That is why it is specifically the 5 books of Moses that are called Torah, as they contain the mitzvot.
The Torah is our wisdom. It is our history. It is our culture. But above all else, as we see in texts 1 and 2, Torah is supposed to be instruction. It is supposed to be a guide to our lives to tell us what to do every day and how to do it. Torah means hora'ah, as Marilyn just read for us, which means instruction. It's supposed to be the guiding document of our lives. And so, as we discussed at length last week, there is the learning element to Torah. Sure, Talmud, Midrash, this is all part of the learning element of Torah. But ultimately, when we learn Torah, we are ultimately trying to figure out Leida es hamaisa asher yasun. I'm quoting from text 1, to know the actions, how to do them. And so the learning aspect is good up until a certain point, right? Because as we discussed at length last week, you can sometimes get into nitty-gritty arguments and disagreements between this one and that one. And if someone comes and just wants to know what to do, that's where halacha comes into play. So halacha is, in a nutshell, the practical application of any portion of the Torah with a bottom line attitude, right? The word halacha comes from the Hebrew word holech, which means to go, which is also the same word as hiluch, which means the way. So in other words, halacha is supposed to literally tell us the way that we should travel, the path that we should take, right? Hillel says, let's light the menorah every night, 1 more candle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, going from 1 to 8. Shammai says, let's go from 8 to 1. Comes halacha, and halacha dictates how we should do it. In this instance, it's to go from 1 to 8. That is the goal, to decide what we should do in a given set of circumstances. Halacha, of course, addresses every single area of Jewish life, including the very, very minute details. Many of you have heard this story from me before, but when I was in Caracas, Venezuela, in the year 2010, 2011, about 12 years ago at this point, I spent a year studying in Venezuela. And our goal was, to literally to teach Torah. So we were 12 yeshiva students, and we would study with people from the community. For half the day, we would study between ourselves. The second half of the day, we would study with people in the community. And one morning, I'm in the mikveh, which is where, that's also where we would shower. Like, we went to the mikveh every single day. And there's a fellow from the community there as well. And he looks at me and he notices that I'm tying my shoes in a particular order. So he asks me, why are you tying your shoes in this particular order? So I said to him, I'll explain it to you after we come out of the mikveh. And by the time we came out of the mikveh, I had 4 different halachas to share with him. Number one, in a mikveh where people are disrobed, you're not supposed to talk about halacha. You're not supposed to talk about Jewish law or Torah, etc. You're not supposed to converse in Torah. Torah is a holy pursuit. You shouldn't do that in the bathroom or in a mikveh or in a sauna or whatever it is. Secondly, yes, Jewish law does tell us exactly how to put on our shoes and how to tie our shoes. You're supposed to put on the right one and then the left one and then tie the left one and then the right one, etc. So halacha, Jewish law, gets involved in every single minute detail and aspect of Jewish law. Of Jewish life, I'm sorry. And what I'd like to do with you now is to take a look at figure 4.1. So you'll see this on page 150 of your book. And this is a very, very interesting graph for the following reason. Okay. Halacha gets divided into 4 genres or subgenres, we should call them. And we're going to see that soon in the video. They're going to go through it properly. But one of the main exercises of halacha, right? Because as with each of these genres that we've discussed to date, there is, of course, the major works which make up that genre. You know, if you're studying this book, then you're studying halacha. If you're studying this book, then you're studying midrash. But also each of the genres reflects a certain methodology, a certain exercise that is being done while studying this element of the Torah, which is different than a different one, right? So, for example, the difference between halacha and Talmud would be obvious. The goal while studying Talmud is to study God's wisdom. Whether you do or don't know what to do is irrelevant, right? Even if you're discussing a story that happened many years ago, but it has, Torah aspects to it, so then you're studying God's wisdom. Beautiful. You're studying a verse in the Torah which has no application to your life, maybe because it applies to a man or to a woman and you are the opposite, or maybe because it applies to a Kohen and you're not a Kohen. It's still the study of God's Torah. The exercise of halacha, however, as we mentioned, is literally supposed to be bottom line oriented. Tell me what to do, how we do it. So as you can see from the selection on page 150, 151, this is, it's just a gorgeous, it's adapted from the Book of Jewish Knowledge, which I highly recommend, put out by the JLI, the Jewish Learning Institute, who also puts out the courses that we study here. And that book has lots of different cool graphs and ways of organizing Torah knowledge. And one of them is this map. So this map is a selection, basically, of throughout history. It's not limited to a particular era. Throughout history, there have been poskim. So remember, that word posik is in the singular, poskim is in the plural. There have been rabbis who are halacha oriented, halacha geared, with a lot of history, with a lot of experience and with a lot of know-how in order to tackle applying the Torah to today's issues, that have been tasked with tackling their issues. So imagine you're a rabbi who lives right around the same time as Edison, right? And somebody presents you with this new phenomenon, electricity. How do we apply the halachas of Shabbos to electricity? Is it fire? Is it not fire? Are you creating something new? You're not creating something new when you create an electric current and you turn it on or off, right? And the same throughout history. There's some really cool questions that are being addressed here. Whether they're living in Johannesburg in the 1990s. You can follow along with me on the map here. And Moshe Sternbach is wrestling with what is the blessing for chocolate, or can one own stock in a company that sells non-kosher food? Stock became very, very popular. And it doesn't quite mean that you own the company, so you don't own a non-kosher company, but you're investing in a non-kosher company. Are you allowed to or not? Or whether it's going back to the 1200s, and Rabbi Shlomo ben Aderet, right, the Rashba, who we've quoted multiple times in these courses, in Barcelona, is wrestling with an issue that till today rabbis act based on, and I mean rabbis, communal rabbis like myself, right? Is it appropriate to inscribe the donor's name on a synagogue annex that he donated, right? Just because a person gave money does not mean that we can put their name on, let's say, the ark where the Torahs are kept. Is that appropriate or is that inappropriate? And then if you go up to the top right, to the Kovno Ghetto, this is one we'll be discussing at length today. This will be our sample halacha for the day. Later, after we introduce halacha and we talk about the major players and the major books, we're going to dive into halacha itself, and we're going to deal with Rabbi Ephraim Ashri, who is most well known for his book called Shalot Utshuvot Mimamakim, which means questions and answers from the depths. He was a rabbi in the Holocaust, in the era of the Holocaust, and he was in the Kovno Ghetto, and then he was also, I think, in Auschwitz, and he dealt with questions like, should Jews who daily experience starvation, abuse, and forced labor at the hands of the Nazis recite the blessing, thanking God for not making me a slave, when they are in fact slaves, right? Or is it permitted to steal a worker's white card? We'll talk more about this later. From the offices of the ghetto council to save oneself from being sent to the death camps, knowing that as a result, someone else will not be saved. These were questions that had never been faced by any rabbi before. It's only from the 1940s, right? Now, certainly the Holocaust was the only time that such questions came up, and God willing, it will never happen again. But in each generation, they had to deal with these questions, and that's the goal of halacha. In other words, the Talmud and Midrash. Where were we here? No, I'm jumping ahead of myself here. The goal of halacha is to tell me the bottom line approach. What do I do in this instance? What do I do in this instance based on these circumstances, based on the technology that's happening in today's day and age, based on my personal circumstances? And there have always been rabbis that have been tasked with doing this, and they are called in the singular a posek, or in the plural poskim. Okay, let's do a little history of halacha. I'd love for all of you to take out your timelines again, okay? And let's just remind ourselves where we are on this timeline. So, of course, we're in lesson 4. So you'll note that we are in the orange section. And in the orange section, I want to show you something. I've mentioned multiple times throughout the lessons that these are not necessarily chronologically. In other words, it doesn't go the Torah and then the Talmud and then the Midrash and then halacha. But there are certain important things to note about these things. And you'll notice that the emergence of a new genre sometimes points to something that's been going on, right? The era, and you'll see this on your screen where it's circled or highlighted. The era of halacha, which we still find ourselves in till today, but the emergence of this genre came only after the Talmud and the Midrash, and this is for a very specific reason. It's important to notice that it's not just halacha. Look, take a look at lesson 4, lesson 5, lesson 6. One can almost say that up until now we've been dealing with one era, and the next 3 lessons are going to be another era, and that is what I would call the specialized branches of Torah learning. So this week we're covering halacha. Next week will be musar and philosophy. The following week, Kabbalah and Chassidus. These specialized genres of Torah study were developed after the completion of the Talmud. While there are some significant exceptions, you'll see that's, for example, the Zohar, or the Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers, and we'll talk about them when that time comes. But for the most part, most of the books on these branches, right? So lesson 4, 5, and 6, all of these specialized areas of the Torah were primarily developed after the completion of the Talmud. And the reason for that is for a few reasons. Number one is that it's important to understand that all of these subjects were blended. They are present within the Talmud and the Midrash, right? Within the Mishnah, within the Talmud, within the Midrash. They're all found there. However, the Talmud's primary focus is on Torah, meaning the Talmud's primary focus is Torah law, but all the time, and this amounts to kind of more than 50% of the Talmud, it diverges to talk about all these different things: musar, philosophy, history, halacha, Jewish law, of course, right? And the Midrash works the same way. Therefore, now the only issue on the table is that in the Talmud and the Midrash, all of these things are woven together. As we saw when we read through a little bit of the Talmud, and we examined it, for example, when we examined the Daf, we saw that ultimately reading through a page of Talmud is like reading through a long conversation, which jumps through to this section, into that section, to this area and that area, which today we know of as different genres. So the goal subsequently was to take all of these genres and divide them into specialized works, which then take those sections of the Talmud, sometimes just to isolate them, as we'll see soon, that was the primary goal of some of the works, and also to codify them and make them more organized so that it's only giving me one element of it. The topic of today will be halacha, the bottom line oriented. Next week will be philosophy and musar. There are other works that take those things, they select those things from the Talmud and put them into a separate work. So from when the Talmud is closed, and that's why you'll see this on your timeline, right? Right after the gray box at the top there ends, that's when all of the specialized genres begin. because to a large degree, a lot of Torah study after the Talmud begins to divide the Talmud. They're all based on the Talmud, as we said. Any conversation of oral Torah from after the completion of the Talmud begins with the Talmud. However, when they do so, they start to subdivide it and based on those areas in the Talmud, make their own specialized works. I hope that makes sense in some way. To illustrate it, and hopefully this will really drive it home, let's compare two texts in text 3. Okay? Text 3 is essentially, text 3 and text 4. Text 3 and text 4 are essentially the same thing. They are, however, about 600 or 700 years apart. Okay? So text 3 is going to be from the Mishnah. Everybody remembers the Mishnah from last week? That's 100 BCE to 200 CE. The first work of oral Torah compiled by Rabbeinu HaKadosh, or Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Judah the Prince. And in the Mishnah, he goes through, this is the first 3 Mishnahs of the entire Mishnah. He goes through the laws of reading the Shema. Okay, beautiful. Text 4 is going to be the same set of laws in the Rambam, in Maimonides, 600 years later, right? So in other words, I would say 900 years later, but 600 years after the Talmud, comes along the Rambam. The Rambam lived from 1135 to 1204, right? So this is way past 500 CE when the Talmud is completed. And the Rambam comes and he codifies Jewish law. And we'll soon talk about what he did specifically. And you'll see the difference between text 3 and text 4, and hopefully that will help to illustrate what the goal is of any halachic-oriented work. Both document the same law, but in very different ways. Okay? Leah, if we can ask you to read for us, please, text 3. Text 3 is the beginning, is the Mishnah, I'm sorry. And then we'll dive into text 4. Vicky will ask you to read that one shortly, which will be in the same set of laws in the Rambam, and then we'll analyze what changed over those 900 years. Go ahead.
And when do we read Shema in the evening? From the time when the Kohanim entered to partake of their Truma until the end of the first watch. This is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. The sages say, until midnight. Rabbi Gamliel says, until dawn. It once happened that Rabbi Gamliel's sons returned from a party, and they said to him, we did not read the Shema. Said he to them, if dawn has not risen, you are obligated to read. And not only in this case, but in every case that the sages said, until midnight, the mitzvah can be fulfilled until dawn. The mitzvah of burning of fats and limbs of the offerings in the holy temple is until dawn. For all the temple offerings that can be eaten for one day, the mitzvah is until dawn. If so, why did the sages say until midnight? In order to distance a person from transgressing. From when do we read Shema in the morning? From when a person can distinguish between sky blue and white. Rabbi Eliezer says, from when can a person distinguish between sky blue and leek green? And one should finish it until sunrise. Rabbi Yehoshua says, until 3 hours into the day, as that is the habit of royalty, to rise at 3 hours. The sages of the school of Shammai say, in the evening, every person should recline while reading the Shema, and in the morning they should stand, as it is written, when you lie down and when you rise. The sages of the school of Hillel say, every person should read after their manner, as it is written, and when you go on your way. If so, why does it say, when you lie down and when you rise? At the time when people lie down and the time when people rise.
Thank you, Leah. So this has been a Mishnah, first three Mishnahs, I should say, in total. The first 3 Mishnahs, each paragraph has a separate Mishnah, of Masechet Brachot or Tractate Brachot. I just learned these last week with a student who has just begun to study Mishnayot. It's a perfectly legitimate study of Mishnah, right? However, go try and understand the laws of how to read the Shema from this Mishnah. You can see them there, but it's very hard to pick apart, especially, and I will tell you this from experience because I was learning with a 11-year-old boy, especially if you're trying to do that without a lot of other context. For example, it's your first foray into Mishnah. It's very difficult. Your head starts to spin. So what does the Rambam do? The Rambam takes it and codifies it. Now, that's a word you may have heard a lot of rabbis use. He codifies it. He codifies the law. What exactly does that mean? As Vicky reads for us text 4, it will become very, very clear. These are the exact same laws, because these are the first 11, by the way, mini halachas of, again, the opening of the Mishnah Torah on the laws of Shema. Vicky, when you can, please, the Rambam. This is 900 years later.
The Shema is read twice every day, in the evening and in the morning, as it is written when you lie down and when you rise, meaning during the time when people lie down to sleep, which is at night, and during the time when people get up, which is the day. What does one read? 3 Torah portions. These are, Hear, O Israel, and it will be, and God said. Reading these 3 portions in this order is what is called reading the Shema. When is the time for reading the Shema? In the evening, the mitzvah can be fulfilled when the stars come out until midnight. However, if a person transgressed and delayed, as long as they read the Shema before dawn, they have fulfilled their obligation, as the rule until midnight was only said in order to distance a person from negligence. When is its time by day? The mitzvah is to begin reading before sunrise, so as to conclude the reading of the Shema and make the last blessing which follows the Shema with the rising of the sun. This interval is about 1/10 of an hour before sunrise. One who delayed and read the Shema after sunrise has fulfilled their obligation, as the time for reading the Shema for one who delayed is until the end of the first 3 hours of the day.
Thank you, Vicky. So let's take a moment now and analyze, and if anybody has some, I'd love to hear from you, the differences between text 3 and text 4. They both describe to us the laws of reading the Shema. Marilyn, do you see any differences between the two of them? What do you think the differences are?
Well, I'll have to say that one thing is that the second version is much clearer than the first.
In 100%, but in what way? We're looking for specifics, because the Rambam does multiple things, all which fall into the category of codifying. What do you think he does?
I don't know. I have to read it over again.
Does anybody have anything they want to share? Anything specific come to mind? Yes, Vicky, go ahead. You're mute. Yep.
Well, I think they analyze all of the different parts and the different opinions that were in the Mishnah, and then come to a specific conclusion as to which is the best and the clearest. And they focus, like, they say this is the way it should be, like till midnight, but then they show that you have some latitude, and the same thing in the morning. This is the best way to do it, and this is the next best way to do it, and this is the final time you can do it.
Exactly.
So, like
so if you take a look on
medium and last.
Absolutely. So if you take a look at our table that we have here open on the screen, right? In the Mishnah, this is point number 2, the one you mentioned. In the Mishnah, they will record the different legal opinions. In the Halachah, in the Mishnah Torah, in the Rambam, right, he will record only the final halachic ruling, or if there's a backup, then he'll do the backup as well. In other words, he doesn't need to bother you with the whole argument. You want to do that, the Mishnah still exists, and you can still study the Mishnah. It's still a perfectly legitimate way of studying oral Torah. But 900 years later, people's heads were swimming. Every time I want to know a law, I just want to know what time to read the Shema. I got to go through 6 different opinions just to understand what's going on here. So he says, let me codify it for you. That's number 1 that he did. But I think we skipped probably the most important thing he did, which here is listed as number 1, which is the Mishnah, remember, was the first foray into oral Torah being written down. And they were very conscious of that. So first of all, it was written very concisely, number 1. Number 2, they specifically wrote the areas where there were disagreements, because that's what they wanted to remember. That's what was being forgotten, right? The areas which were very well known and very, the background information, they're like, everybody knows that already. I don't need to give you the background to that. Like, for example, maybe a Mishnah should start with, there is an obligation on each Jew to read the Shema. The Mishnah doesn't start that way. It will never start that way. It assumes you know you need to read the Shema. Not only that, it assumes you know we need to read it once in the morning and once at night. It assumes that you know all about teruma. It assumes that you know all about kohanim and when they go to the mikvah and when they don't go to the mikvah. These are things that are not even mentioned in the Mishnah, but that in order to understand the Mishnah, you need all that information. Comes the Mishnah Torah, comes the Rambam and says, you don't need to know all that information right now. Right now, all you want to know is what time to read the Shema. Let me tell you, this is the time. By the way, the Rambam is still 1,000 years ago, right? In today's halachic works, or I should say more like in today's apps, right? In the applications on your phone that you download that are going to tell you the time for the Shema, they don't even bother you with what time of the day it is. They just tell you, you know what? You got a phone, you got the time, a notification will pop up. Today, the latest time to read the Shema is 9:33. And which is roughly where it is now. Maybe it's 9:23. Somewhere around there is what it is at this time of the year, right? And all of that is because of the evolution of the way halacha works. So here you see some of the differences between the Mishnah and the Rambam. I think Marilyn mentioned that the Mishnah is a little disorienting. Like it doesn't really present them in an organized manner, one on top of the other. So the Mishnah, and this is the third point, the Mishnah bundles together different types of laws. The Mishnah Torah or the Rambam says, no, each law is organized in its own section. I'm not going to bother you now about sacrifices, which also happen to be, could only be done till midnight. That's not important for you right now. We're talking about the Shema. You want to go to the section on sacrifices, you go to the section on sacrifices. You want to go to the section on Shema, you go to the section on Shema. The section on davening is the section on davening. Each area discusses its things in an organized fashion. And all these differences point to one primary difference, which is, as we discussed in lesson 3, the Mishnah was written down despite a reluctance to write it down. In other words, it was a forced move. It was an attempt at just writing down something so we don't forget it. The Jewish people are being dispersed. We don't want to forget it, but we also don't want to make oral Torah written. The Rambam is, and right, so of course all opinions need to be transcribed because it needs to be part of that process. We need to remember all the different opinions. The Mishnah Torah says, my goal is not to prevent forgetting. That's not my goal. My goal is just to simplify study, or more like simplify action. You want to know how to do something, you come to my book and you do it. The Rambam writes this in his introduction to his Mishnah Torah. He writes that the purpose of this book is to serve as a guidebook, a halachic handbook for anyone who wants to know what to do. Come here and you will know what to do. For example, one of the things the Rambam writes in his introduction is he writes, it is my goal that if a person just wants to know what to do, they can have a Bible and they can have my book. And this is why he calls it Mishnah Torah, which means the second Torah, so to speak, the appendix to the Torah. He says, you can have the actual 5 books of Moses and then jump to my book and you will know exactly what to do and how to do it. Now, he's not discounting or saying that you shouldn't study all the other books. He's just saying that when it comes to practical action, you need a handbook to be able to look into. What is the reason for this change in nature? The reason for this change in nature is this change in nature of how oral Torah was approached. You have to remember that at the time of the Mishnah, they were still trying to preserve a certain concept, which was people learning. We spoke about this last week. People learning versus book learning. Oral Torah was supposed to be much more about people learning than book learning. 900 years later, by the time the Rambam comes around, he says, at this point, the books themselves became sources of knowledge. In other words, this is a book on Halacha, this is a book on Musa, this is a book on Chassidus, and they themselves became sources of knowledge. They still quote extensively from the Talmud, of course from the Torah, and it's all built on the same things, and they need to be able to prove that. But the book themselves became something that we study.
It was in response to what was happening at that time, and this was a more modern world than the ancient world. So
yes.
So you have it's like commentary on the Torah. You have the Torah, you have the Mishnah Torah. So they just needed to organize it.
Right.
So
I would
people could
also add a
understand.
couple of historical elements, which I think is what you mean when you say it was a more modern time.
It was more modern. It was meant for more people. It was
Right. Not just more
dispersed
people.
books.
Hold on. It's important to understand what was going on during those 900 years, right? Or let's call it 600 years, right? Because we'll go from the completion of the Talmud until the Rambam comes around. That 600 year era, if you take a look at your timeline, is known as the Savaraic and Geonic era. There were still Geonim and Rabbanan Savarai, which were the leaders of the Jewish people in Babylonia and in Israel. They were still leading the Jewish people. But during that time, there was also a decline in yeshivot in Babylonia. There was also increasing difficulty in travel and communication between the various locales where the yeshivas were. By the way, an interesting thing to see is an additional feature for this lesson. It's on page 182, 183. It's an article called "The Four Captives." I encourage you to take a look at it after the class, not now, but it talks about how the Jewish people start to really spread to Spain, North Africa, and Western Europe, right? Which today we all know as bastions of Torah learning, right? North Africa, are you kidding me? That's like the heart of the Sephardic Torah study happened there in Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria and in Egypt, of course, right? In all these places. That's where the Rambam himself was. Spain, are you kidding me? It was a golden era of Jewry and Spanish Jewry, and so many Torah scholars come from Spain and Portugal and that area, right? And Europe, right? Till just recently, Judaism was centered in Europe, France, and Germany, and Spain, right? Well, let's talk about Western Europe specifically. Ultimately, what happened was it eroded the authority and the influence of the Babylonian Geonim, or these leaders of Babylonian Jewry. And by the beginning of the 10th century, there was no longer one global center of Torah learning anymore, right? Today, we would all say that. Even after the establishment of the State of Israel, we would still say there isn't really one place that is the center of all Torah learning, right? I mean, you could say New York is one of the centers. You could say Jerusalem is one of the centers. You could say Bnei Brak is one of the centers. These are all centers of Jewish learning, right? Basically, from that era begins each community having its own yeshivot, its own Torah leaders, the world we're familiar with today, and as a result, also having its own halachic authorities. And it's under these circumstances that the learning of Torah was transitioning from a model of exclusively learning from people to a model of learning from books. Later on, by the way, the printing press is also going to have a big effect on this. But for now, even in the manuscript world, this is having a big effect on all that. And that's why you see, let's make it a clear line here. Take a look at the screen. That's why you see that these specialized works of Torah all begin certainly after the closing of the Talmud, and most of them begin towards the end of the Geonic era. You see that? At the end, the last 1,000 years, let's call it, or 1,200 years, 1,300 years of our timeline. Okay. It is now time to talk. I mentioned earlier that there are 4 types of halachic works. We spoke about codes, right? The Rambam was one of them that fell into codes. We spoke about responsa, which was that whole map was all responsa, when rabbis with a posek, a halachic authority, would need to respond to an on-the-ground question about what's going on. But there are also digests and commentaries. And in order to really appreciate all of this, we really need a proper tour of halacha and the major works of halacha. And that's going to be in the video presentation, which is coming up. We have a new tour guide this week, which is exciting. We also have a map to follow along. Okay, so if you turn to page 158, 159, you're going to need to turn your textbook the other way, right? And it's color-coded, etc. And our tour guide will reference, the colors and the different 4 categories. You see that there are 4 colors on the page? She's going to give us a proper tour of all this. We're really working from the Torah. We're going to start again working from the Torah down. We'll only briefly cover the Torah, the Mishnah, the Talmud, all that, because the Torah, the Medrash, the Mishnah, the Talmud is all stuff we're familiar with. And then she's really going to dive into the last section here, which is the last 1,200 years, which is the genre of halacha. So please turn your attention to the video screens for a tour of the tree of halacha.
A key book in the Library of Judaism is the Shulchan Aruch, also known as the Code of Jewish Law. The Shulchan Aruch is often described as the Jew's user manual for life. What's in the Shulchan Aruch? When was it written? Who wrote it? Why does the Shulchan Aruch among the many other books on Jewish practice written over the centuries, occupy such a unique place on the Jewish bookshelf? The Shulchan Aruch is actually a combination of two different works composed in the 16th century in two different places by two different authors. To understand what these two great Torah sages achieved, we first need to take a closer look at the field of Halachah, Torah law. Halachah is the bottom line of Judaism, where the Torah's teachings translate into the do's and don'ts of daily life. It covers every area of life, from religious ritual to business dealings to interpersonal relationships. In all these and more, the Torah teaches us right from wrong and shows us how to lead a righteous and godly life. Where do these laws and practices come from? Basically, Halachah has three sources. The first source of Halachah is biblical law, which derives from the text of the Torah, as expounded by the Halachic Midrashim and the Talmud. Halachah also includes rabbinical laws, rules and regulations enacted by the Torah sages of each generation, by the authority vested in them in the Torah. Finally, Jewish practice includes minhagim, customs arising from Jewish life and hallowed by generations of practice. In each generation, Torah scholars and halachic authorities called poskim authored books documenting and discussing these laws. This chart lists some of the primary books of halachah written over the centuries. Let's take a closer look at the tree of halachah depicted here. You will notice that the halachic works fall under four general categories. One type is the halachic codes, marked in blue on this chart. A code is a book that organizes laws by subject. Halachic codes focus primarily on the final rulings and practical applications, rather than the laws, sources, reasons, and divergent opinions. A second type of halachic work is halachic commentaries, marked in red. A commentary is a work written as an accompaniment to an earlier work. The commentary discusses and explains the parent work. It may also cite opinions from other sources and argue with other commentaries on how to understand parent work. A third type of halachic works is halachic digests of the Talmud, marked in green. A digest is a summary of an earlier work. For example, the Talmud contains many halachic rulings, but these are obscured by the profusion of discussions, disputations, and case studies. The halachic digests of the Talmud isolate these rulings from the Talmudic text. The fourth type of halachic works is halachic responsa, marked in yellow. A responsum is a written response by a halachic authority to a specific halachic question that's presented to him. A typical responsum may run for many pages, citing and analyzing dozens of sources from the Talmud, the Talmudic commentaries, the halachic codes, and their commentaries, as well as previous responsa. It will then weigh the merits of several proposed solutions before rendering its decision. Now that we have defined the various types of halachic works, let us take a tour of the tree of halachic works you see here on the screen, and learn about the books and authors that represent major milestones in the history of halakha. The most primary source of Torah law is, of course, the Torah itself, which contains the 613 mitzvot, or biblical commandments, along with the laws communicated to Moses at Sinai and transmitted orally through the generations. For many generations, these laws, as well as the detailed explanations of the laws written in the Torah, were transmitted by word of mouth from teacher to disciple, until they were recorded in the very first halachic code, the Mishnah, by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi 1800 years ago. The next major documentation of Torah law was the voluminous commentary on the Mishnah known as the Talmud. The Talmud records many thousands of discussions by hundreds of sages extending over 7 generations and more than 300 years. When the Talmud was redacted in the beginning of the 6th century, it was the most comprehensive record of Torah law compiled up until that point. After the Talmud came the Gaonim, who for 500 years headed the great Torah academies in Babylonia. The Gaonim wrote commentaries and digests on the Talmud. They also authored numerous responses to halachic queries that were sent to them from Jewish communities all across the world. During the Gaonic era, the entire Jewish world looked to the great yeshivot of Babylonia as the authority on all matters of Torah law. But beginning in the 11th century, a period known as the era of the Rishonim, there emerged centers of Torah learning throughout the Jewish diaspora, in North Africa, Spain, and Western and Southern Europe. One of the early Rishonim was Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, known as Rif, who lived and taught in Morocco and Spain. The Rif authored the most important halachic work of his time, a halachic digest of the Talmud. Another important digest of the Talmud was compiled about 250 years later by the Rosh. The Rishonim also authored many of the great commentaries on the Talmud, without which the Talmud would be a closed book to us today. While these commentaries are not halachic works per se, their explanations and discussions of Talmudic passages determine how many points of Torah law are applied. The Rishonim also wrote many thousands of halachic responsa, applying their Talmudic knowledge to issues of the day. But the most important developments in the literature of halacha in this period are two major halachic codes. The first is the Halachic Code, completed in the year 1180 by Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, also known as Maimonides, or the Rambam. Maimonides titled his code Mishnah Torah, which means review of the Torah. Indeed, Mishnah Torah is the only halachic code that covers all areas of Torah law, including laws pertaining to the service in the Holy Temple and the agricultural laws that apply only in the land of Israel. Mishnah Torah systemized all the laws in the Talmud, as well as the rulings of the Gaonim during the nearly 700 years from the closing of the Talmud to Maimonides' own time. But as monumental and comprehensive a work this code was, it would still not be the final word on halacha. New halachic questions kept on being raised. Furthermore, not all of the halachas agreed with Maimonides' conclusions. For example, the Ravad, Rav Avraham ben David of Poskiris, authored glosses on the Mishnah Torah in which he presents his disagreements with one of Maimonides' rulings. Consequently, in the generations following Maimonides, many more halachic works of all four types, digests, codes, commentaries, and responsa, were written. About 150 years after Maimonides, a major halachic code was compiled in Spain by Rabbi Yaakov ben Asher, the son of the Rosh. While this code was more limited in that it only included laws that were relevant to Jewish life at that time, it expanded on Maimonides' code by including rulings from dozens of halachic works composed parallel to Maimonides' code and in the generations that followed. Rabbi Yaakov organized his code into 4 turim, or columns, each covering a different area of halacha: Orach Chaim, way of life; Yoreh Deah, instructor of knowledge; Even HaEzer, stone of salvation; and Choshen Mishpat, breastplate of judgment. After the Torah published his code, many great halachas wrote commentaries on this work. As we will see, 2 of these commentaries form the basis for the next major halachic code, the Shulchan Aruch. During the era of the Rishonim, 2 primary schools of halacha had formed, each with its own unique customs and traditions. The Sephardic school, followed by the Jewish communities of Spain, Southern Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, and the Ashkenazic school, followed by the communities of Western, Central, and Eastern Europe. For example, Rif and Maimonides were both Sephardic sages. On the other hand, the author of the Torah tended more toward the rulings and customs of the Ashkenazic traditions, contained in the works of the Tosafists, his father the Rosh, and other Ashkenazic halachic authorities. The beginning of the 16th century saw a shift of focus among the halachists. These Acharonim, or later sages as they're called, did not, as a rule, consider themselves qualified to argue with the Torah sages of earlier generations, the Rishonim. Thus, while the Rishonim looked to the Talmud and the writings of the Gaonim as their primary sources of halachic rulings, the halachic works, composed by the Acharonim, focus on navigating the rulings and opinions of the Rishonim. The same is true of the 2 great sages, Rabbi Yosef Karo and Rabbi Moshe Isserles, both of the first generation of Acharonim who gave us the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch is the product of 2 earlier works by these 2 halachic giants. Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote a commentary on the Torah, which he titled Beis Yosef, the House of Yosef. In this work, Karo developed a distinctive approach to deciding between differing rulings among the halachas. He regarded 3 major halachists, Rif, Maimonides, and Rosh, as the big 3. Whenever he encountered a difference of opinion among the early halachists, he would decide the law according to the majority view among these 3. Rabbi Yosef Karo then proceeded to compile a code of his own, the Shulchan Aruch, which means set table. The Shulchan Aruch follows the same 4-column format as that of the Torah, chapter by chapter. But Rabbi Yosef Karo felt that the Torah's rulings tended more toward those of the Ashkenazic Rishonim. In his code, he implemented his big 3 halachic approach, which gave more weight to the Sephardic halachic traditions. While Rabbi Yosef Karo was writing his Shulchan Aruch in the city of Tzfat, the Ashkenazic halachas, Reb Moshe Isserles, the Ramah, was also laboring to codify the halachic rulings of the Rishonim. Ramah had also written a running commentary on the Torah and was creating his own halachic code. But when Karo's Shulchan Aruch was published in 1563, Ramah felt that his own work was now superfluous. So instead of publishing his own code of Jewish law, Ramah wrote glosses on Karo's Shulchan Aruch, in which he noted those areas in which he disagreed with Karo's conclusions and where he felt the need to add additional laws and customs not included in Karo's work. The two works were subsequently published together, with Ramah's glosses inserted in a different font within Rabbi Yosef Karo's text. The combined work, which essentially summarized the bottom line of halachic rulings up until their time, now became the fundamental code of Jewish law, on which hundreds of subsequent halachic commentaries and codes were authored, representing a great variety of customs and practices, but all looked to the Shulchan Aruch as the documentation of the grand halachic consensus, incorporating both of the two major halachic traditions of the Jewish people.
All right. That's a long history, but I hope that the bottom line became very, very clear. In other words, just like the Talmud represented a significant moment where the Talmud summarized all discussions on oral Torah and law and philosophy and everything up until that moment, and from then on no one argued with it, the Shulchan Aruch became a very, very similar turning point. In other words, everything this video was discussing was kind of from the Talmud until the Shulchan Aruch. The moment the Shulchan Aruch was introduced, and especially because the Shulchan Aruch comes in tandem with the Ramah. By the way, the names of their works are the Shulchan Aruch, which means the ready table, the set table, and the Mapat HaShulchan, which is the tablecloth for the set table. Again, the Shulchan Aruch is the main work, which summarizes all the laws, but then there are moments where he goes Sephardi instead of Ashkenazi, and the Ramah comes and gives us the Ashkenazi version for that, but it's not a completely different set of laws. It's just addendums, glosses, they called it, right, to the actual Shulchan Aruch. So between those two together, ever since they have been published, and by the way, that was right at the beginning of the Acharonim. So that symbolizes the era of Jewish literature that we're in now, right? Take a look at your timeline. On the bottom, you'll notice that the last era is called the Acharonim, right? Follow the beginning of the Acharonim up, and you will notice that in the halachic section, the Shulchan Aruch is published right at the beginning there, right? The Shulchan Aruch is published together with the Ramah. And from then on, any halachic works begin with the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, and then have their, commentary on it. Now, they may disagree with the Shulchan Aruch. They may disagree with the Ramah, but they are quoting him as the official beginning of any conversation. And the reason they may disagree with him will obviously have to be stated why, and they'll go back to the Talmud and explain why, etc. But practically speaking, in today's day and age, everyone follows the Shulchan Aruch. Sephardim, just the Shulchan Aruch, and Ashkenazim, the Shulchan Aruch with the glosses of the Ramah. Okay, up until now we've been studying about halacha. It is time to dive in and see an example of the way the halachic process works. So one of the fun things we're going to do today, as we dive into the world of halacha, we're going to talk about one particular question, and we're going to take it from the beginning and see how it evolves over time, along with how it gets applied to different scenarios over time. But one fun thing we're going to do as we go through the halachic process and we watch the exercise in action is we are going to follow along on our map. What do I mean? On our timeline map, if you will, the tree of halacha, which was just dissected in full in the video, in the tour, if you will, you'll notice that at different moments we will be in different of the four categories of halacha, and we will be in different eras of history. So we're going to start, of course, by quoting the Torah, and then we're going to work our way down through the Midrash and the Talmud and the Mishnah and the Talmud, and then eventually to the responsa. Right, to how we apply this in this particular day and age. So back on figure 4.1, we saw an example of 35 different queries of halachic responsa, right? Today, we're going to focus only on the one from Rabbi Ephraim Ashri in the Holocaust, but we're not going to get to him until all the way at the end, because we first got to see the background to this whole thing. So please try and do your best. In my book, they have it on the side highlighted. I don't know if you guys have that by text 5, 6, 7. Do you have the little tree in miniature with a highlight of where we're holding on the tree? Do you guys have that? Like right on the side of text 5. Is there like a miniature version of the tree of halacha
Yes,
with a
but
highlight of where.
you can't follow it because it's just like shaded.
Right, it's just shaded, but at least it'll give you an idea of where we're holding on it, right? So you'll see the bold one. The first thing we're going to quote is, of course, from the Torah, so it's all the way at the top. You'll at least get some sort of idea of where we're holding, generally speaking. I'll try to mention where on the tree of halacha it is, but always if you go back to page, what was it, 150, 151, I think? 158, 159, you'll always be able to see where exactly on that tree we are, and you're welcome to do that as we move along, okay? So we are going to be talking about something called pikuach nefesh. Pikuach nefesh means when a person's life is in danger. And the question on the table is, can we save one life at the expense of another? So the starting point for this discussion is going to be all the way at the beginning of the Torah, when God creates life. Leah, can you get us started, please? Text 5.
God created the human in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them.
Okay, so this is the beginning when God creates life, and because a human being is created in God's image, of course, now on the here, so you can see each time they'll give us this, it looks like in the slides, right? So now we're in the Torah, that's where we are right now. A verse from the Torah, text 5. And what is it saying? It's essentially saying the Torah places infinite value on human life because a human being is an image of God. Okay. Now, as we know, the 10 commandments embody the entire Torah. Right? If you'd like to see exactly how, there's a really cool additional feature. Some of you may have noticed it already in lesson 1, where it goes through the 10 commandments and shows you each category of laws, which one of the 10 commandments they're hinted to in. But the Halachic Midrash Mechilta points out something very interesting. The Torah was given, the 10 commandments, were given to us on 2 tablets, 5 and 5, right? And there's a lot of discussion about why that was. The Mechilta, the Medrash, so we're going to jump down our tree a little bit now. We're in the section of Medrash now, right, which is right here, Mechilta. And the Medrash says there's something very significant about the placement of the law of the commandments on the tablets. In other words, commandment number 1 has some sort of relationship with commandment number 5. Commandment number 6. Why? Because number 1 is the top of the tablet on the left or on the right, and number 6 is the first one on the tablet on the left. Subsequently, number 2 and 7 have a strong relationship. Number 3 and 8 have a strong relationship. Let's see, Marilyn, if you can read for us, please, from the Medrash, text 6, where he dives into the notion of the value of human life as it is hinted to in the 10 commandments. Marilyn, if you can please unmute yourself and read for us, please, text 6, the first commandment.
How were the 10 commandments given? 5 on one tablet and 5 on the other. On one tablet it says, I'm the Lord your God, and opposite it, on the other tablet, it says, do not murder. This teaches us that anyone who spills blood, the Torah considers as if they have diminished the stature of the Almighty.
So says the Medrash, right? And we're starting to see the value of human life develop and evolve. As time goes on, the Medrash is extrapolating from this verse in the Torah, which says that a human being is created in the image of God, and says something interesting. On the tablets, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am God, your God, is on one side, on the right side at the top. And Lo Tirtzach, which is do not murder, is at the top on the left. This is to teach us that spilling blood, right, murdering, is tantamount to diminishing the stature of the Almighty, because you have lessened, so to speak, the image of God in this world to a certain degree. Okay, beautiful. This is described in this ultimately comes down in a legal sense in the Torah in in Leviticus chapter 18 verse 5, which is text 7. And Vicky, can you read it for us, please? Right, so we're back on our tree at the Torah. Go ahead.
You shall keep my statutes and my laws, which a person shall do and live by them. I am God.
So this unique value, thank you, Vicky, of the human life, of diminishing the image of God, comes down as a principle in the Torah, which means, B'chai bahem, Hashem says, you should live by my statutes. And the Talmud explains, what does it mean to live by the statutes? Text 8. Vicky, you keep going. Transgression or death. So we moved along on our tree. We're now in the Talmud. Go ahead.
With all the transgression of the Torah, if a person is told transgress, so that you should not be killed, they should transgress rather than be killed. For the Torah states, live by them, not die by them.
Okay, so now we have a practical application. We're beginning to see the beginnings of halacha, even though it's in the Talmud and it's a little, obscure because it's in, a sea of Torah study. But we're beginning to see an application of this law in practical sense. Why? Because essentially what the Talmud is saying is that based on this verse, text 7 was the verse, and text 8 is the Talmud extrapolating the verse. Says the Talmud, because it says v'chai b'hem, you should live by Hashem's statutes. You should live by them, not die by them. So every single mitzvah in the Torah, soon we'll see there's an exception of 3 mitzvah, but every single mitzvah in the Torah gets pushed aside for the greatest value that Judaism values, which is the value of human life. So for example, if it's Shabbat, and you have to desecrate Shabbat in order to save someone's life, let's say put out a fire so that they don't burn, someone who's disabled and can't escape the fire, shouldn't be burned to death. Or someone is in a hospital and the doctor has to administer some sort of life-saving or whatever it is, some form of medication or procedure in order to save the person's life, boom, all the laws of Shabbat go out the window. All the laws of kosher go out the window. All the laws of tefillin and talit and Shabbat candles and whatever it is, all go out the window for the sake of human life, as we'll see shortly, besides for 3 mitzvot, which we'll get to in a moment. It's going to become very relevant to the halacha we're trying to get to all the way at the end, the big 3. But before we get to that, text 9 is the Mishnah with a practical example of when a law of the Torah would get pushed off for the sake of saving someone's life. So Elise will ask you to read, and you can turn your attention to the screens again to see where are we on the tree. We've gone back a little bit before the Talmud to the Mishnah. And Elise, when you're ready, the Mishnah in text 9, saving a life on Shabbat.
Okay. If a collapsed building falls on someone on Shabbat, even if it is doubtful whether they are there or they aren't there, and furthermore, it is doubtful whether they are dead or alive, we must clear the rubble heap from them. If the person is found alive, we continue clearing the rubble.
Thank you. This is text 9, which starts to really get practical about this law. In the case of a fallen building on Shabbat, right, this was a very, very practical law just, a year ago, 2 years ago in Surfside, Florida, when a building collapsed and there were many, many Jews inside the building. And now we're digging through the rubble in order to find human life. And we don't know whether human life is intact or not intact. In other words, obviously, it's a very different law if we're looking for a dead body. That's one thing, okay, and that's a mitzvah for a person to be brought to proper Jewish burial. Or looking for human life, which may be alive, you may be saving a human life. Very, very different. So as a general rule in Torah law, the way we approach these things is as follows. When there is a doubt about the halachic status of something, we follow the majority of possibilities. This comes, for example, in the halacha about a piece of meat. Let's say you find a piece of meat in not a piece of meat, right? In today's day, let's call it a package of meat, a sealed package of meat, right? It doesn't have a hechsher on it, but no, this is before the time of hechsherim. This is before the time of kosher symbols on meat. So you find a piece of meat that's sealed, it's nice and beautiful, and it's in a town that has 9 kosher butcher shops and only one other butcher shop that's non-kosher. The assumption is that we can assume that the meat is kosher and a Jew can go and eat that meat based on that. Obviously, the background here is that we're assuming that there's no telltale sign. If the non-kosher butcher uses one type of packaging and the other 9 use a different type of packaging, or in today's day and age, where all kosher meat is sold with a kosher symbol on it, so then the law changes. But assuming that there's no way to know, we assume it comes from the majority. The same thing is true about percentages, right? If there's a 55% chance that the person is alive, so then we assume that there's a chance that the person might be alive. Now, this was all the Mishnah, right? So we're digging through a fallen building in order to find human life, right? We violate Shabbat in the attempt to save a human life. But the Talmud starts to analyze the Mishnah, so let's move along on our tree here. The Talmud starts to... Hold on, Vicky, hold on. We're smack in the middle there. The Talmud starts to analyze this Mishnah. Elise, if you can refresh, please, text 10.
Okay, the Mishnah states, if the person is found alive, we continue clearing the rubble. Isn't this obvious? This needs to be stated in order to tell us that we continue our efforts, even in the case that the person is mortally wounded and can only live a short while.
Text 10 is fascinating. Text 10 starts to get into a lot of questions that we have in today's day and age. For example, in 2012, I received a phone call. I was in yeshiva in Toronto at the time. Many of you know this. And it was a phone call from an organization called the Gift of Life Bone Marrow Foundation. Anybody ever heard of them before? Okay. I was identified as a match for a fellow. Thank God I didn't need to give bone marrow. I was able to just give peripheral stem cells, what's known as PBSC, as a match for someone who, a woman, a 45-year-old woman, was a mother of, I forget, 4 or 5 or 6. And I ultimately went through with the donation. Now, as it so happens, I wasn't violating any Torah law by donating. Okay, but let me fast forward to the end of the story. So they check up on you after the fact, a week later, a month later, 3 months later, 6 months later, and all along, all the updates, I'm getting great updates. She's doing much better. She's doing fantastic. And by the way, I should note that my procedure was considered an emergency procedure because she wasn't given much time. After 6 months or 8 months, I get a phone call from them. They check in. They're constantly checking in. At this point, it's just routine. I pick up the phone. Hey, how's she doing? Mr. Rifkin, Rabbi Rifkin, we forget how they addressed me. We regret to inform you that your recipient passed away. As you can imagine, I was devastated, and it took the woman on the line, who really was just, she was just the call person. She was just my contact person, but she says, "Listen, at the Gift of Life Foundation, we like to say that one way of looking at it is that you gifted her with 6 more months of life." Right. So what text 10 is essentially asking is this question. Let's say we would have had all this information beforehand. I would have known that I can donate PBSC to this woman, and all it will do is extend her life by 6 months. She's still going to die, but all it's going to do is extend her life by 6 months. And let's go further to say that somehow it would be halachically prohibited for me to donate to PBSC. Now the question becomes, right? Like, so for example, let's say it would have been a donation. Let's say it would have been violating Shabbat. The question is, do you violate Shabbat when you're going to save a life, but all you're going to do is allow that person to be alive for another month? Text 10 essentially says, afilu chayesha, that even if the person can only live for a short while, we still go ahead and save their life. Why? Because that's how much Judaism values human life. And now is when we start to work our way down the tree. Comes the Rif. The Rif is the first digest. Remember, he's not a codifier yet, but he's a digest of Jewish laws as they are in the Talmud, right? So this is Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi. This is 1085, 500 years after the Talmud. And he says, Phil, text 11, please.
A dying person has the legal status of a living person in every respect as it is written, not until the silver cord snaps. One who touches a dying person in any way that hastens their death is a murderer.
Says the Rif, based on this Mishnah and the Talmudic extrapolation that it's even for a temporary life saving. So he says, if so, it turns out that the opposite works that way as well. In other words, a dying person, someone known as a gosis, could be even someone who's going to sputter his last breath within the next 24 hours. Everybody's sure of it. It's 100% certain. He's losing blood, whatever it is. He's going to die within the next 24 hours. You do not have the right to end his life 24 hours earlier. That is considered murder as per the Torah. You can already see how this would start to apply, right? Things like pulling the plug, things like, right? All these sorts of arguments start to begin. They're coming to the fore already 1,000 years before we're starting to apply them to medical hospitals, right? They're coming to the fore because these laws are evolving as the times are evolving. Okay. Let's leave that conversation where it is right now. We'll leave it with the Rif. Okay. We are now going to introduce something which is known as the redder blood argument. Before we do so, I have to finish what I started mentioning earlier, which is that rule that every single law of the Torah gets pushed off for the sake of saving a life applies to everything but 3 exceptions. Okay, 2 of the exceptions, let's get out of the way. We're not going to talk about them today. They are idol worship and certain forms of prohibited relationships, most notably incest and adultery. Okay, but leaving those aside, so for those laws, a person for those mitzvah, a person does give up their life. But the third one is, of course, murder. Right? You never give up your life for a mitzvah of the Torah. But if the mitzvah on the table is murder, in other words, if someone holds a gun to your head and says, "You shoot this person, otherwise I will shoot you," you take the bullet and you don't shoot. You don't kill somebody else. Where does this come from? So we need to back up again. Go to the Talmud. Text 12 is the Talmud discussing this law. Lisa, can you read for us, please? Unmute, please. Text 12 on page 164. The Talmud discusses whose blood is redder. Go ahead. Lisa, do you have text 12? Oh, we do not hear you. I'm sorry. You had mentioned earlier that your microphone wasn't working. I apologize. Let's go back up to the top here. Leah, if you can read for us, please, text 12.
A person came before Rava and said to him, "The chieftain of my village said to me, 'Kill so-and-so, and if you do not do so, I will kill you.' Rava said to him, 'Let yourself be killed rather than that you should kill. Why do you think that your blood is redder than theirs? Perhaps the blood of that person is redder.'"
All right. So now we're starting to get into the weeds. We have two people, two lives. Essentially, what Rava is saying is, why is your blood any redder than his? Right? Now, here's my question back to you, Rava. All right? Rava, you tell me that I'm not allowed to shoot the other person in order to save my own life. But why is his blood redder than mine? You're asking me why my blood is redder than his. Why is his blood redder than mine? You have two lives on the table here, both being posited against each other. Only one is going to survive. Who says his life is more valuable than mine? Why can't I shoot him? So Rashi, in his commentary on this Talmudic passage, explains Rava's logic. Marilyn, if you can, please, text 13, right? So let's go back to our tree. We are in Rashi, which is, of course, a commentary on the Talmud. Go ahead.
Rava is saying your premise is that every mitzvah is set aside in order to preserve a life. So you think that also this mitzvah, that is the prohibition against murder, should be set aside in order to preserve your life. But this transgression is different from other transgressions in that, in any case, there will be a loss of life. Torah only allowed the mitzvot to be set aside because of the preciousness of a Jewish life. But who says that your life is more precious in God's eyes than the other person's life? Perhaps that person's life is more precious, with the result that a transgression will be committed and a life will also be lost.
Thank you, Marilyn. In other words, what Rashi is saying is our starting point is that the Torah forbids the act of murder. And that prohibition remains in force unless the Torah sets it aside. And we cannot use the Pikuach Nefesh principle, which applies to 610 mitzvahs of the Torah, because that doesn't apply to these three, one of which is murder. So you cannot remove, so you have a standing obligation not to murder. Right? It's one of the 365 negative commandments of the Torah. This is one of those mitzvahs that does not get pushed aside to save your life. So as a result, we go back to our standing position, which is you are not allowed to murder. And since committing the transgression does not result in the preservation of life any more than not committing it, so the prohibition of murder remains in force. Hence, the prohibition against murder is an exception to the general rule that a person should be killed. That a person should transgress the Torah rather than be killed. Okay.
Well,
so what
if you know that person is going to be killed anyway?
Good question. There's a lot of what ifs. For now, let's stay focused here. Okay. There's a lot of ways that this law is going to be applied, and we're gonna follow one of them. And you're right. This is another good question. Like, what's it they're saying? They're killing him anyways. The question is whether you're going to kill him or somebody else is going to kill him, right? And that may play into our scenario, which we're really trying to get to in the Holocaust. Okay, hold on. So now let's contrast the case of the person being coerced to commit a murder with another case cited by the Talmud, which presents another twist to this type of moral dilemma. Okay? Why? Because till now we've been saying you have a transgression, you have a prohibition that you're not allowed to murder someone. And now we're telling you, if you murder, you might be saving your life. What if it's the exact opposite? And then we'll contrast them. Text 14. Vicky, if you can, please. The dilemma of the water jug. So we're back in the Talmud.
Two people are traveling and one of them has a jug of water. If they both drink, both will die of thirst. If only one drinks, he will make it to a settled place. Ben Petorah expounded, better that both should drink and die than one should witness the death of the other. But then Rabbi Akiva came and taught, the Torah states your brother shall live with you. Your life comes before the life of your fellow.
Thank you, Vicky. All right. So in this case, the halachic ruling follows the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Let's just put that out there right now. So in other words, you keep the water for yourself since your life comes first. But my question for you is, can we contrast? Can we try and figure out what the difference is between text 12, which was Rava's case, and text 14, which is Rabbi Akiva's case? Why is it that in Rava's case we say, in both instances, it seems like we have one life pitted against another, yet in Rava's case we say your life does not take precedence. Why should your blood be redder, and therefore the other person dies? But in Rabbi Akiva's case we say, no, your blood is redder to a certain degree. You survive, and the other person doesn't survive. At first glance, it may seem like they're both identical. However, as you start to dive into them, you start to see that the two scenarios are very different. In fact, the difference goes to the very heart of what moral choice is from the perspective of Torah and Halacha. Where are you now, and what is the moral choice? What is the action that you are taking? One perspective, which we'll call the non-halachic perspective, is that the moral choice I'm being called upon in both scenarios to make is who should live, me or the other guy in the scenario. But that's not the way the Torah looks at it, right? The Torah, Halacha specifically, takes a look at this scenario and says, it's a completely different approach. It starts with a basis that goes like this. You don't decide who will live and who will die. That choice is not a decision that is given to a Jew to make. I don't get to make a decision on another person whether they should live or die. Only God makes such decisions. Yes, I have free choice, and I need to make my choices based on the reality before me as I see it. But the only choice that I have is what will I do in this situation, not whose life is more valuable. My sole concern here is, this is very halacha oriented, what do I do? From this perspective, the two cases are very, very different. Let's analyze them again. In Rava's case, the question is to kill or to be killed, right? In other words, if we analyze it through the lens that we're analyzing it now, let's call it the lens of halacha. What do I do in this situation? The question is, do I kill or do I not kill? Do I take someone else's life or do I not take someone else's life? Whether or not I do a forbidden action. And in that instance, we immediately say, you don't kill someone else. It's not that there's two lives pitted against each other, which one is more valuable. No, you cannot do a forbidden action. You cannot go and actively kill someone else. In the water jug situation, it's the exact opposite. You're not being asked whether you're going to kill someone else or not. You're being asked whether you're going to take an action to preserve your own life with the water that you have. And you're going to not save someone else's life. And in that instance, there's a very different scenario. Why? Because two people are traveling, and what does it say? Take a look at the text again. What was it? Text 14. One of them has a jug of water. In other words, you have your own jug of water. And the question is, should I share with the other person or not? In this case, Halacha says very clearly, you stay with the status quo. Again, and it's really based on the same logic. Who says his blood is redder than yours? So therefore, you have no right to go and kill yourself for him by giving him the water, right? Even giving him half the water, which is going to result in both of you dying. So now we have a very easy way. Thank you. Now we have a very easy way that we can change the scenario and make it more similar to Rava's, and you'll see immediately the law will change. And in fact, the Shita Mekubetzet. So we're really jumping along here now. Shita Mekubetzet is in the 1500s. He's a commentary on the Talmud. What does he do? He says, let's alter the scenario just slightly. The Mishnah says one of them has a jug of water, and therefore we say Rabbi Akiva says he's not obligated to share with his fellow. But what's about if the jug of water doesn't belong to him? Elise, if you can read for us, please. Text 15. What's if the water belongs to both of them? Text 15.
Oh, okay. Regarding the case of the two travelers where the law is that one who has the water may drink it to save their own life, based on the principle that your life comes before the life of your fellow, it would seem, however, that if one of them grabbed the water away from the other and drank it, causing the other to die, that person would be guilty in the eyes of heaven. As a principle, why do you think that your blood is redder would apply in this case?
Thank you, Elise. So in other words, when the water belongs to one of the travelers, is the other traveler permitted to grab it from them? Right? Is he allowed to take the water away from him and drink it? In that instance, he is considered a murderer. Even though he saved his own life. From a non-halachic perspective, you look at this, you say there's two lives on the table, there's one jug of water, one is going to live, one is going to survive. So if one guy grabs it and takes it, what did he do? He didn't do anything. They were both going to die. In fact, he just saved one person. But from a halachic perspective, there's only one question on the table. What are you going to do in this scenario? Remember, the word halacha comes from hiluch, going. There's a fork in the road. You can choose to either take the cup of water or not take the cup of water. Where is it naturally now, and what are you going to do? So if it's naturally in your possession, you drink it, you haven't done anything. You haven't murdered another person. But the other guy drinks the same cup of water, he's murdered you. Why? Because he changed the status quo. He went down the...
He stole.
He
stole.
The stealing here is completely irrelevant. The point, meaning, of course, it's besides the case is the fact that he stole, but more importantly, the fact that he chose to take an action to end someone else's life.
But that's taking an action.
That's the point.
Someone.
The point is
he knows when he steals, that person is going to die.
Very good. So, in other words, from a non-halachic perspective, whether the person did the action or didn't do the action isn't so relevant, right? In other words, whether you were proactive or just passive about it. It doesn't really make a difference. The point is where you ended up. But from a halachic perspective, that's the only thing we care about. The proactive choice that you choose to make is what halacha is supposed to be dictating for you. Which path are you going to follow? Which way are you going to go down? This leads to an interesting law, which is text 16 in the Jerusalem Talmud. So we're backing up again back to the Talmud. Phil, if you can read it for us, please. The besieged caravan.
If a group of people are traveling on the road and they encounter heathens who say to them, "Give us one of you that we may kill him, otherwise we shall kill you all," even if all of them will be killed, they should not hand over a single Jewish soul.
This is a very interesting law. Why? Because if this was a decision of deciding who will live and who will die, this law makes no sense. In either case, the person who is handed over will die, right? So why not save everyone else by handing over that person? But that's not the issue at all. Who lives and who dies is not up to us. Remember that? We only have jurisdiction over what we do. And if we hand over a person to the murderers to be killed, that's an action that the Torah forbids. We're getting involved in that murder, and that murder becomes our fault. That becomes an action that we took. And even to save another life, even to save many lives, the Torah forbids it. This is why there's some discussion in the Jerusalem Talmud as to how to act if the heathen singles out a particular person. He says, I want person X. And according to one opinion, the others can save their lives by giving him over, because in any case, this person is sure to be killed, and we're not getting involved because the heathen is the one who identified him. There's whatever. The halachic conclusion, by the way, is that you can't. It's forbidden to hand that person over unless they're particularly guilty of some sort of crime in the eyes of the heathen, so then there might be allowance to do it. But this is an interesting, in other words, it changes the way we look at this whole thing. It's not so much about the value of one life over another. In this instance, it's 1 life versus 50. It's much more about the action, about whether we're going to be a murderer or not. Okay. We are now applying it to Rabbi Ashri's case in the Holocaust, which we'll talk about in a moment. Before that, let me take some questions. Phil, go ahead.
Okay, quick question. So today we're studying halachic laws and, what the bottom line, what should the answer be in a given situation. So recently, as you know, I posed a question. This was after my mother passed away, and it was involving, could I attend a certain event? And I remember you came back and you said, I think halachically speaking, nothing prevents you from attending the event. Now, I was curious on one level, that was a specific situation. You researched, you found the answer, you consulted other scholars, but I'm just wondering, in that case, you said it doesn't prevent. So are there also times when halacha can not lead you to an affirmative answer? Like just the way you phrase the answer to me, you know what I'm saying? Like, is it always just, you must do this but in this case, you said nothing prevents you.
There will usually be a halachically advisable or halachically recommended course of action. The reason I use the term nothing prevents you is because in certain instances that's the main thing on the table. A person wants to do X, Y, and Z, and they're asking, is there anything wrong with that according to halacha? Why they want to do it, why they're incentivized to do it is a different question. It might be emotional. It might be, I don't know. Even in some instances, it might be business related. They want to do something business related. They want to travel down this path. They want to know, does halacha prevent it or not? There's a whole different discussion, which is what is, and I don't think halacha would be the word here. Halacha is always concerned about what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. What's advisable, what's recommended, usually falls into the following 2 genres, which we're going to discuss, or the following 10 genres, which we're going to discuss in the next 2 lessons. Things like musar, philosophy, chassidus, guidance, ethics, morals, right? That's what's discussed in works like Ethics of Our Fathers. Yes, I know halacha allows me to do this and doesn't allow me to do that, but now tell me what's recommended based on general moral principles of the Torah. Is this the spirit of the way the Torah wants us to act? And that's a different question. So you are correct that there's another subtext here besides for halacha. Halacha will always be concerned with what are you allowed to do, what are you not allowed to do. Does that make sense? Okay. Vicky, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, it was the comment I was going to make earlier. I think this comment about whether you're allowed to try to save a life on Shabbat by digging and working, it actually, I read in a news article that they made that an official opinion about the workers in Turkey right now.
Oh, wow.
Trying to save lives.
Very relevant. I didn't even think about the practical, one that's going on right now. Absolutely.
Yeah, Rabbi Lau actually gave an official opinion to all the workers and said, yes, you can work, you must work. And because people were still being found alive on Shabbat, that they could and should.
This was this past Shabbat.
Work right through Shabbat in Turkey. Right. Yes.
Wow, that's beautiful. I didn't know that. Thank you.
Yeah, there's an article about it.
I will probably research it. If you can send me that article ASAP, I would appreciate it. I will probably do some more research on it, and I will share it tonight. Instead of sharing about Surfside, I'll share about that because I think it's very relevant. It's very practical.
Yeah, it's right now.
Unfortunately. Okay. But for now, we're going to go to a story from 80 years ago. We are going to dive into the Holocaust in the middle of World War II. And this book, From the Depths, Shalot Utshuvot Mima'amakim, becomes one of the most amazing testimonies to the Jewish people's loyalty to Torah. These are 5 volumes of Halacha, which are written by a man whose name was Rabbi Ephraim Ashri. He passed away in 2003, born in 1914. And in these volumes, Rabbi Ashri documents dozens of halachic questions that were posed to him during the Holocaust when he was a young rabbi in the Kovno ghetto, and then even past that in Auschwitz, etc. And even under these inhumane conditions, what do Jews want to know? They want to know what the Torah instructs them to do in these circumstances. The queries posed range from seemingly minor questions, right? Like, are you allowed to make the blessing, thanking God for not making me a slave, when you are in fact a slave laborer in a Nazi concentration camp, to heart-rending dilemmas such as the following query, which is going to be text 17. Now, Rabbi Ephraim Ashri, it is to be remembered, is a rabbi. He's a posek. His job is not to get emotionally involved in what's going on the ground. His job is to do one simple thing. He's presented with a question, even if it's a crazy question under these harsh, inhumane circumstances. His job is to do exactly the same thing. By the way, this is also a testimony to his immense scholarship, that he was able to do this even in the concentration camps without access to his library of books. What does he do? He does exactly the same thing as any posek, any legal rabbinic authority, halachic rabbinic authority did for thousands of years before him, literally for 1,500 years before him. What did they do? Their job is to go back to the Torah, see the verses, go to the commentary on the Torah, the Midrash, especially the Halachic Midrashim, as they're unpacking the Torah. Then go to the Talmud, starting with the Mishnah and the Talmud, and see how they unpack it, and then go through the however many years of halacha have been around until then, and see if there's any A, precedent, or B, discussion about something that's similar to this, and make his best informed decision based on that to apply it to the scenario on hand. And as was the tradition in poskim before him, these legal halachic rabbinic authorities before him, he documents all of this in his response to these crazy, unprecedented scenarios that are being presented before him. Okay, so we're going to get the question just like Rabbi Oshri got the question, and what we're going to do is we're going to follow through his response as he bases it on all of the opinions in the tree of halacha, which we have on page 158, 159. So let's start with the question on the table. Leah, if you can read it for us, please. It is on page 169 in your books, text 17.
On Elul the 16th of 5701, which was September the 8th, 1941, the Nazi SS commander Gok arrived in Lithuania. It was he who in the end liquidated the Kovno ghetto. The reputation of this evil and bloodthirsty murderer had preceded him, evoking panic among those imprisoned in the ghetto, as immediately upon his arrival, he executed a number of Jews. At that time, there arose the issue of the notorious white cards. The matter was as follows. Yardan, the German commander of the Kovno ghetto, instructed the Jewish council to distribute among the workers in the ghetto 5,000 white cards, which he gave to them. These individuals would be the only ones allowed to remain in the ghetto with their families, while the rest would be liquidated. At the time, there were about 30,000 Jews in the ghetto, including 10,000 workers. I was asked, are those who were grabbing white cards for themselves to save themselves acting properly, knowing that they are preventing another Jewish family from being saved?
The question on the table. Is it permitted to grab a white card for oneself if taking it prevents another from surviving? Now that other is unnamed, right? In other words, the basic status of everyone in the ghetto is that everyone is going to die. Besides for, what was it, 5,000? Besides for 5,000, which were going to survive. And by you grabbing it, you just ascertain that you become one of those 5,000. Very interesting application, a heart-wrenching, a gut-wrenching application of all of this law that we've been discussing up until now, right? Is who decides whose blood is redder than someone else's. So what do you think? Based on the halachic precedents that we reviewed so far, remember, text 12, text 13, text 14, we analyzed the difference between text 12 and text 14, text 15 and text 16. How would you rule the question posed to Bayashri? Is a person allowed to steal a white card from the ghetto council offices in order to save their own life and their families?
No.
Marilyn says no. Vicky says no. Anybody say yes? Phil, what do you think? Before Phil speaks, let me just remind everybody, and I think Phil might be able to provide a different perspective here because of his legal background as a lawyer. In other words, I just want to remind the class here, this is not a discussion about what is heroic, right? That might, and I think Phil just touched on this earlier. That might be a discussion which is dealt with in Ethics of Our Fathers. That just because you're allowed to do something doesn't mean you should do it. Just because you're right, there might be something more heroic to do. There might be a better moral choice. But there's a halachic legal question on the table. What does Torah law permit you to do and not permit you to do in such a situation?
Isn't it just
Well, I
like
see it.
stealing the water?
Hold on, Marilyn. Let's let Phil give his opinion. Go ahead.
Well, maybe you were going to say it, but I see this more analogous to the jug of water versus the affirmative action of, shooting somebody and taking their life. So I would say that's why I would say the answer.
Very good. Very good. I think everybody else that was answering today, and correct me if I'm wrong, was for the most part answering what they feel should be done in this situation. Phil is saying, I have some texts in front of me to base it on. 12, 13, 14, 15, right? 16, 17, up until now. Or sorry, 16, not 17. 17 was the case. In other words, based on that, what is this analogous to? In other words, Phil is saying, let me put on my post-it cap. Let me put on my cap of a halachic legal authority, rabbinic authority, who has to base it on quotes from the Talmud. When you try to do that, essentially you have two halachic precedents to consider. Oh, hold on. I was going to move on, but Marilyn wants to share something. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, it's like the case, it's similar to the case with the water bottle. Stealing someone else's water bottle.
Okay. Let me just, is it more similar to the case of stealing someone's water bottle, or is it more similar to the case of keeping your own water bottle?
Stealing someone else's water bottle.
Okay. So we have now two different opinions on the table. Essentially, I want to just do this with you guys step by step, because then you'll really appreciate where halacha lands in this and where Rabbi Ashri landed in this. Essentially, we have two halachic precedents to consider. Number one is the law that it is forbidden to take action. Remember what we said, the difference between action or passive standing by. We are forbidden to take action that directly results in another person's death in order to save yourself. Okay. The second halachic precedent that we have here is the law that a person is permitted to refrain from saving another person's life in order to save his own life. In other words, if the action that you need to take is to save someone else's life, which is a active commandment that we have to save someone else's life, but we are allowed to refrain from saving another person's life in order to save yourself. Now let's apply this to the white cards. And what we are going to quote now are all of the authorities that Rabbi Ashri quotes before he makes his halachic ruling in this instance. So he starts by quoting text 18. Let's go back to our tree. Where are we here? Text 18 is the Ramah. Oh, hold on. They jumped ahead of here. Okay, you know what? All right, let's do this. In the end, what happens is like this. Because of these two factors, Rabbi Ashri says no one was actively being handed over to the Germans. The Germans were going to come and kill everyone. So the Germans were the ones doing the killing. No Jew was doing any killing. And the white cards, because they were not in anyone's possession, remember I asked you, what's if the water was owned by both people? So therefore, it's not actively stealing, as Marilyn suggested, water from someone else. And the conclusion was found in Shulchan Aruch and its commentaries, and by Ashri rules that it was permitted for a person to try to save themselves and their families by taking a white card. But let's explore what he based this on. So we'll start with the Ramah. The Ramah, if you remember, is the Mapas HaShulchan, the glosses to the Shulchan Aruch, the tablecloth to the Shulchan Aruch, the Ashkenazic approach to the Sephardi, right? And the Ramah writes as follows in text 18. Here's the Ramah on the tree of Halacha. And in text 18, he writes, Marilyn, can you read for us, please? Text 18.
A person who anticipates damage that will occur to them is permitted to save themselves, even though this will cause damage to another person, as cited in Nimukei Yosef, commentary to Talmud Bava Batra, chapter of Hashikafim.
So text 19 is going to be the Nimukei Yosef that he's quoting. Go ahead, Marilyn. He quotes Nimukei Yosef, which is way earlier on the tree. Go ahead.
However, as the Nimukei Yosef concludes there, if the damage already arrived in their domain, a person is not permitted to remove it from themselves if this will cause damage to their fellows.
So I'm sorry, that was not the Nimukei Yosef. So this is the Sma, right? The Sma is taking the opposite approach. He says, look at the Ramah. The Ramah says you're allowed to divert damage from your property. If the damage has not yet come to your property, you're allowed to divert damage from coming to your property. But what about if the damage is already in your property and you're going to move it out of your property into someone else's property? Says text 19, the Sma says you're not allowed to do that. In other words, there's a big difference as to whether you have damage in your property and you're going to divert it out, or whether it's coming to you and you're just going to make sure it doesn't come to you.
Well, I don't understand.
One second. What is the most practical instance of this? The most practical instance of this is a flood. Keep reading, Marilyn, and then we'll take questions. Hold on. So text 20 is the Gra, which is Rabbi Eliyahu of Vilna, lives only 200-300 years ago, and he quotes the Yerushalmi. Go ahead.
A person who sees that a water channel is about to flood their field, as long as the water has not entered this field, is permitted to divert the water, even though this will cause another fields to be flooded. But once the water has entered the person's field, they are not permitted to divert it to another field. Regarding a quartermaster, as long as the legions have not arrived, a person is permitted to bribe the quartermaster not to lodge soldiers in their home, even though this will result in the soldiers being lodged in someone else's home. But once the legions have arrived, it is forbidden to do so.
Thank you. So Rabbi Eliyahu of Vilna, in other words, the Vilna Gaon, the Gra, is essentially applying, the first half of his law is a direct quote from Yerushalmi. He's talking about a flood. You have a flood that's coming, and the Talmud Yerushalmi makes it very clear that if you're allowed to put up walls in front of your home, let's say your house number 3 down the hill. And then
Rabbi, I have to leave. I'm just saying goodbye.
Okay, bye.
Sorry, I have a doctor's appointment. Goodbye.
Okay, we're almost done here. 5 minutes, just a mile down the road is another house. Your house number 5, and then there's house number 6. That's a little bit down the road, down the hill. And you're going to put up a barrier so that the water doesn't come into your home, and you're going to divert it to keep going down the road. And as a result, the next house will be flooded. That person would have been saved if the water would have come into your house, right? Now, here we're not talking about a life-threatening situation, but what it does show us is how halacha views action versus passive. In other words, an action versus just taking a passive approach. The Yerushalmi there says, the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud says, you're allowed to divert the water so long as the water hasn't come into your property. But if the water has already come into your property, you're not allowed to start pushing it out, pump it out in order to keep going down the hill and then flood someone else's property. Says Rabbi Ashri, I'm going to apply these laws to the same question that we have with regards to the Kovno Ghetto white cards. He says, we have on the table here like this, the white cards are in nobody's possession, right? Just like Rabbi Eliyahu of Vilna applied it to the legions, right? Everybody knows about this. The Russian legions would come into towns, and then they would just choose anybody's house to stay in. If you gave them 50 ruble, they would move on to the next house. And then they would ransack the house while they were there, right? So you just pushed it forward away from your house. Now, if they're already staying in your house, you're going to pay him $50 in order to get out of your house. That you're not allowed to do. But if he didn't come into your house yet, and as he's at the door and he's looking for where to stay, you pay him $50 to keep going down the street, that you're allowed to do. Just like you were allowed to do it by the water, you're allowed to do it by legion. But again, no life and death situation just yet. Says Rabbi Ashri, if that is the way halacha looks at whether it's an active action or a passive inaction, he says, let's apply the same thing to the Kovno Ghetto. He says, there are 5,000 white cards. It's not like they were assigned to 5,000 people and you're going to steal someone else's white card. Oh. That would clearly be prohibited. Just like the water, it was prohibited to steal water from someone else. But since the 5,000 white cards are now in the offices of the ghetto council, and they're going to belong to anybody, and the flood is coming, 25,000 people are going to be murdered by these horrific Nazis, Yimach Shemam v'Zichram, may their names be blotted out, you're allowed to take one white card and keep the flood moving down the road, even though someone else is going to die because you took that white card. But why? Because halacha takes the approach of action versus inaction. In this instance, you didn't murder anyone. You took an action to save yourself. The people doing the murdering was the Nazis. They were the ones who killed the other 25,000 people. You just took the white card in order to make sure that murder didn't come, that flood of murder didn't come and enter your family and your life. Now, whole different question about whether it would be a heroic and moral choice to refuse the white card and give up your life so that someone else's life can be saved. That can be a different question. But halachically, you are not prohibited. By Ashi's conclusion was, you are not prohibited because the decree wasn't instituted, because the murders weren't happening yet. It's not considered active harm, and therefore you're allowed to take a white card and just make a decision which will result in you not being harmed. So let's summarize what we learned today. This is an amazing example of halachic exercise. But what we're really trying to appreciate is the tree of halacha, which means halacha is the bottom line in Torah. It is a genre where our sole focus is, no question is too big or too small. I don't care if it's whether you tie your left shoe or your right shoe first, or whether it's if you're allowed to take a card from a white card from the ghetto council in order to save your life. Massive questions versus tiny questions. Halacha takes the same approach. What is the bottom line? And the job of a posek is to tell us the direction. 2 paths open in front of us. Do I go to the right or do I go to the left? Thank you all for joining us for lesson 4 of this 6-week journey, coursing through Judaism's authors and coursing through Judaism's most important works and the authors that inscribed them. This has been lesson 4 on halacha, and please join us next week at the same time for lesson 5, where we will tackle Musar and Jewish philosophy.
Thank you.
Thank you.